Just a quick note that this video is sponsored by Squarespace, one of the leading platforms for designing and creating online stores and websites. We'll talk more about it later in the video. Hey guys, today is a very sad day. Well, it's both sad and happy because this video marks the conclusion of my class discussion series, which is an accomplishment but also kind of depressing because I had a great time making the videos, but we still have this episode, so let's end on a banger. Last but most certainly not least, we're going to be talking about controllers. I would guess not many people even know what a controller is, since that's not a term thrown around as often as marksmen or mages, but since we have yet to talk about the third group of the holy trinity of classes, controllers are mostly supports, which would fit the healers that complement tanks and DPS. Within traditional class-based games, while all three classes are integral to the functionality of a party, healers are the most essential part of the entire team. If the tanks are the bones of the body and the DPSers are the muscle, then healers are the heart, literally keeping everyone alive. Sadly, due to their more passive and backseat playstyle, they happen to be the least fielded role in pretty much every game. While they're titled healers, any class that offers primarily utility or supportive abilities can fill that job. It could be buffing their party, debuffing the enemy, or of course healing and shielding. Regardless of what they provide, games are usually balanced around requiring at least one healer. League of Legends understands this to the fullest, as controllers are not only a champion class, but an entire role. As we all know, the 5 roles in the game are top, jungle, mid, bot, and support, and almost every support champion belongs in one of the 2 controller subclasses, so these guys make a very core part of the game's essential experience. Now would be a good time to talk about them. Unlike the DPSers and tanks who have more or less the same jobs for their subclasses, controllers have 2 very different ones, catchers and enchanters. If it's not obvious by the name, the fundamental goal of a catcher is to find opponents out of position and lock them down, usually through the use of a long-ranged ability. In some cases, they have the power to lock down entire battlefields by creating intense zones of threat that can deter enemies from going through them. Catchers are your aggressive controllers. They don't have the same full-blown rushdown of vanguards or divers, rather they specialize in safe but equally effective engage, as their skills often pull targets away from the assistance of their teammates. Enchanters are your defensive controllers and are more faithful to the healer archetype than their counterparts. They boast a wide array of supportive abilities such as heals, shields, buffs, and disengage crowd control. While not as effective as catchers, enchanters can essentially make it much easier for their teammates to seek out mispositioned enemies by increasing their kill power and or preventing counterattacks. While in teamfights, they may very well single-handedly be the difference between life and death for their allies. Even though their respective duties are vastly different, the overall purpose of the controller class is, as the name implies, to establish control. Whether it's through zoning enemies or healing allies, these champions are fantastic at manipulating the playing field to gain a favorable advantage while preventing the enemy team from doing the same. One other thing about the class is their contribution to a team's macro play. For tanks and DPS classes, their job is pretty simple: find the enemy and take them down. Most of the time they tend to focus only on themselves since their abilities largely revolve around themselves. Controllers have a fundamentally different objective: to set up the board. Rather than outright trying to shoot anything that moves, support champions spend much of their time running around the map, securing vision for their team and trying to ascertain the enemy's location. They play very differently from just about every other class, even specialists. Just like how healers are critical to the success of a party in other games, supports make or break their team's performance to the point where they can influence the outcome of the match far more than the actual carry roles. Nowadays, the League community usually points to jungle diff when they try to think of what was the deciding factor, but I would honestly say the difference between a good and bad controller is more meaningful than a good or bad jungler. They're in a very interesting spot right now. Over the past few weeks, I spent a great deal of time talking about how carry-focused the game is becoming, with almost every role consisting of high DPS or high engaged champions. This is probably the first time in League of Legends history where even in the professional scene, top, jungle, mid, and ADC are all fielding hyper carries or carry-oriented champions. But because of this, what ends up happening is that controllers become that much more valuable since they're now the only role left who can provide that crucial engage and utility for their team. Fighters and slayers have the lowest supportive capabilities of all classes, since their kits are designed to pack as much damage and self-sustainability as possible. Nowadays, it's extremely rare to find a carry champion who helps out their team in some way, shape, or form. In the old days, a lot of champions actually had abilities that would support their own team. For example, we had Gangplank's Raise Morale, which would give his teammates bonus attack damage and movement speed. Warwick's Hunter's Call would grant his allies bonus attack speed. There are still champions who can help out their allies a little bit. Jarvan IV's Demacian Standard is a persistent attack speed aura for him and his allies, or Lee Sin can dash to an ally to shield them from an attack. But aside from those two, I can't really think of that many other non-support champions that provide token utility for their team outside of just hard crowd control. With new champions becoming increasingly more and more selfish, controllers and I guess wardens are now the only champions who can provide buffs and utility in the entire game. This in turn makes them, dare I say it, the most important yet underappreciated class in League of Legends. Some of you might be confused as to how they can be all that I said so far when they feel like the role that carries the least. But they aren't meant to carry games, at least not in the way you think. Remember, controllers are designed to control the field, which has a lot of implications to it. You can't tangibly grade a catcher or enchanter's pressure like you can a diver or an assassin. The 6 other roles are usually judged by their kill participation, CS lead, and KDA. Katarina is doing well if she's 14-1 and doing badly if she's 3-9. As controllers, what determines if you're doing well or not are none of those things. A whole new set of abstract objectives and nuances are present for them, which makes it difficult to tell exactly how good they really are. In terms of mechanics, enchanters and catchers are among the easiest champions to pick up, but almost impossible to master. Even someone like Thresh, who is widely considered difficult to play, has abilities that are simple to use. The reason they're hard to get good at is because they're the only class that has to pay attention to 9 champions rather than 5 or less. If you're playing Camille, the only people she cares about are her opponents, more specifically the enemy carries she wants to dive on. When you play a marksman, you only really need to think about yourself and whoever is in front of you. But supports have to pay attention to not just the enemy team, but their own. As Lulu, do you use Whimsy on an ally to buff them up or on an enemy to polymorph them? Who do you use your shield on? Who do you wild growth? As Thresh, who do you use Lantern on? Do you flay to knock enemies away or keep them on top of you? Do you use your Death Sentence on the tank to get them off your ADC or on the enemy backline so your diver can rip them to pieces? When you have to think about both your allies and the enemies, it adds a metric ton of other things that you're now responsible for. Sadly, controllers are often discarded as brainless champions, especially enchanters. I'm sure at one point or another, all of us have made fun of Janna, Soraka, Sona, Lulu mains as people who would just get carried and did nothing to deserve it because they aren't mechanically hard to play. You just press a button on your teammates. Wow, so much skill. But if you think about it, in a chaotic teamfight, the other roles have only one job, which makes it easy for them to figure out what they have to do. Let's say you're a top laner and you lose a 5v5. You can go back to your replays and think to yourself, if I didn't miss my stun, I would have won that fight. Or if you're the ADC, you might think, if only I flashed that Pike ultimate. But as an enchanter, you have to account for so many small differences in your actions that could have drastically changed how that fight would have played out. Many people think all an enchanter has to do is protect their AD carry and that's it, or all a catcher has to do is land their Q on an enemy mid laner. No, not always. Sometimes shielding your frontline is the correct option so they can survive just a little longer while your backline deals with the pesky diver tunneling on them. Sometimes saving your hook for after the enemy team's engaged might be what keeps your team alive. All of these split-second decisions are often forgotten in the grand scheme of things, but given the butterfly effect in League of Legends, they really do add up. The only times a controller is commended for their actions is when they do something really ostentatious, like a Bard who lands a clutch 5-man Tempered Fate, or Nigo who gets a 5-man Pop Blossom, or a Taric who perfectly times a 5-man Cosmic Radiance. It's not just in combat where controllers have a lot to think about, the neutral game keeps them just as busy. Vision control requires them to track all 5 of the enemy team's movements and habits so they know where to optimally place wards around the map. To my knowledge, you can only put down 3 stealth wards and 1 control ward at any given time. Securing vision of the enemy bot side jungler could lead to your own jungler getting Herald and first tower up top. They can also effectively double as a second jungler, roaming around the map whenever it's safe for them to do so. Everyone remembers a game where the enemy support was all over the map scoring ganks after ganks. That's actually why Bard has been one of the highest win rate supports for the past 10 patches. The frustrating thing is that these little macro decisions are never recognized because no one pays attention to them except for controller mains. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that controllers and the support role as a whole deserve way more credit than they're given right now. Their contributions and micromanagement are what allow the top jungle mid and ADC to do all that they do. Sona can augment her entire team's tempo to insane levels. Taric literally makes his team invincible. Lulu has over a 50% ban rate because she's one of the hardest counters to fighters and slayers, the 2 most popular classes right now. People hate Yuumi because she attaches to their top laner and all of a sudden they can 1v5 the entire game. I'm not necessarily implying that controllers are never appreciated. Typically, it's obvious when there's a support gap when one is way more proactive around the map, but considering how much emphasis we put on hard carry champions, too many players take supports for granted. Are they the common denominator in every game and you should blame them every time you lose? No, sometimes everyone on your team has negative brain cells, and no matter how much you try to make it easy for them to win, they're just not going to be able to do so. Supports aren't always the reason games are lost, but they most certainly are part of the reason games are won. You can have a useless top laner and still win games, a useless jungler, a useless mid or ADC and still win games. But if you have a useless support, it becomes nearly impossible to win games, especially if the enemy support knows how to punish you. You cannot compensate for the lack of macro pressure and utility these champions can provide. And believe me, even if your Morgana is hard feeding, if she can land a Q on a priority target, that can all but assure you win the fight. The reason mage and carry supports aren't liked very much is because they're useless when behind. But catchers and enchanters will always have a purpose because they don't need levels, they don't need items, they just need to use their abilities properly, and that's it. Before we continue on with the last part of the video, I mentioned Squarespace at the beginning, so let's talk more about it. If you're trying to start a business, blog, online store, or website of any sort, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that lets you easily make a professional and polished first impression. They have some of the best user interface and usability I've seen, and simplify the website making process so you can upload images, videos, add web pages, and even member areas to allow exclusivity. The most convenient thing about Squarespace's web builder, at least for me, is the sheer amount of templates they give you so you can design websites in any way you want, and you can literally customize the layout of each page. Super helpful if you want things to look a certain way. Best part is that they also sell domains, so you don't have to purchase one elsewhere, you can get them all done here. If you're thinking about starting a business, club, an organization, or online presence, I highly recommend Squarespace. They're one of the big names in the website building world, and to help you get started, check out the link on screen or in the description for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. For now though, let's get back into the video. Now there's one more thing I want to talk about before I wrap it up. The question of if controllers should be allowed to go into other lanes. Aside from Ivern, every catcher and enchanter is exclusively fielded as a support. The most common assumption would be that they can't survive on their own. To an extent, that's true. They usually have high cooldowns, poor wave clear, and not much kill pressure. But personally speaking, I actually think it's more of a cultural thing. It's sort of the same problem tanks are facing, where if they're strong enough to be popular, everyone would start complaining, but if they're not strong, no one wants to play them. There have been many instances where we've seen Sona, Lulu, Soraka, and Karma go top. Or I think it was season 9, that one time we saw Rakan mid. And we all remember the terror that was the Ardent Sensor meta back in season 7. Every single time an enchanter or a catcher was able to go top or mid, the entire community would get pissed off because you would cheese so many games just by picking a controller. Dealing with one is hard enough, let alone two. When you have that much lockdown and shielding going around, the enemy team just can't do anything. I'd say the problem comes from people's perception of controllers. Again, they look at them as brain-dead freeload champions that get carried, just because they're not the ones actually going in and killing everybody. So when we see people playing Lulu top or Sona mid, the community sees it as an indictment on what makes a good player. Now, far be it from me, but I don't ever want to deal with enchanters in top lane because there are too many cheese top laners as it is, but like I said, there's a profound lack of respect and appreciation for how powerful controllers are as a class. Just like how healers are the beating heart of a party in MMOs, controllers and support champions are what keeps the team alive, literally. Having talked about it, I'm actually curious how crazy it would be to see Thresh jungle, Taric top, Bard mid, maybe there's secret OP strategies, who knows? But I do like how League has definitive classes and roles, however at the same time it stifles creativity and prevents players from expanding on the limits of the game. Although then again, I don't like the fact that Viego can go top jungle and mid, so maybe I'm just being a hypocrite. That wraps it up for controllers, and that wraps it up for the class series. I had a great time talking about the 7 classes and just want to say I appreciate all the people who suggested I make videos talking about them because aside from why no one plays, this series has the second highest total views out of all my League videos, which is awesome. Since this is the last class video, it would be awesome if you could show your support by leaving a like. Don't forget to sub to the channel for more content like this. Consider joining me on my Discord server and following me on my socials. If you have yet to watch my previous episodes on fighters, slayers, marksmen, tanks, mages, and specialists, I highly suggest you do so. I mean, I think they came out pretty good if I do say so myself. But that's it for today. Thanks again so much for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Take care.